Okay, guys. So this is going to be a little off tangent from what we've been doing, and in fact, is something I was planning on covering later on in the term. But it was brought to my attention that you guys have some kind of portfolio review, I guess this coming week. Um, and it's a little surprising that they would want you guys to prepare um, turntables of your guys' work before it even being completed. So, but with that said, it sounds like some of you have the need to basically do turntables. So, for the sake of time, since most of you have been working in ZBrush, I'm going to show you how to do a turntable in ZBrush. They do have a pretty simple way to do it. So let me just walk through that now. Okay. Here I have a model that I have done in the past. This is actually, let me actually drag this out. Sorry, guys. Here we go. Let's bring that out this way. And for whatever reason, it's not going to let me do that. That's great. Okay. Okay, I can get to the menu I need. Sorry about that. Okay, so here we have a model that I've done in the past. This was actually an aerial that I did for my daughter. She asked me to do aerial, so I did aerial. Now, with that said, let's say I basically want to now do a turntable of her. There's a couple things to bear in mind about this when you're doing this in ZBrush. The first thing that you want to basically make sure is set up properly. If we go up to our document menu, this is where we essentially have the resolution that we set for this document, for your project, basically. In this case, you can see that it's a pretty high-res document that I have here. I probably don't want it to be that way. So what I'm going to do is set it to something more reasonable, maybe something like 720p. I believe 720p would have a width of 1280. Let me actually turn off Pro. Make sure you turn off Pro when you're setting this, so that way you can independently set this. So I think it's 1280 by 720. I believe that's correct. So once I input those values, I want to go ahead and hit resize. And it's going to prompt you to resize the document. I'll say yes. And in this case, now you'll see that it's been resized. But now it basically also drops your canvas to 2D mode. So I'm trying to rotate my model, and instead of rotating, I'm getting a bunch of different aerials. So I'm going to hit Control-N just to clean my canvas. I'm going to drag out my model and immediately hit T so that I'm in 3D mode. Okay. Now let's go ahead and kind of place the model the way we want it to be. Something like that seems pretty nice. So now that I have my document size set appropriately, the next thing I want to do is probably turn on the floor. Now down here at the bottom, you'll see this this floor grid. Now if you're using the UI that I've given you, you'll have access to that. If you don't have this UI, what you're going to want to do is go up into, I believe it's Draw. And if I go down to this button right here, it's essentially the same thing. So I'm going to turn on the floor. And what you're going to get is something that maybe doesn't encompass a large enough floor. So let's go back to that Draw menu. And we're simply going to basically crank up the grid size. Okay, something about that will do. And the only reason I'm doing this is so I get like a little cast shadow on the bottom. Now that I have a grid for a floor, I have a camera kind of roughly set right here. You don't have to lock your camera or anything. If you just have an angle that you like, just go ahead and kind of set it there. And I'm going to start it with something like this. And now the next thing we have to basically have set is our light. Now down here again, in our UI here, you have this light placement, but I know some of you don't have this ZBrush GUI that I gave you guys activated. So I'm going to go up into the light menu up here, I'm just going to make sure that my light is set up exactly where I want it. I can move this around and it's going to basically render my model from that angle. I typically just like to get a nice straight ahead, slightly angled up view. That seems pretty good. Once that's set, let's move over to our render menu. So please refer to this step by step as I'm doing this in case you guys get lost here. So I'm going to my render menu, and the first thing I'm going to do is go down to render pass. Sorry, not render properties, but render pass. And just off the bat, let's go ahead and hit this BPR button. This is called BPR. It's basically short for best preview rendered. So I'm going to hit that, and let's see what we get out the box with ZBrush. Now this is just software renderer in ZBrush, so it's not going to be as polished as what you may get with something in Maya, like with Mental Ray or Arnold especially. But you can see you get something fairly good. You know, this isn't too bad. So now once I have just a nice standard renderer set up, let's say that I like this image. The next thing I want to do is now set up my turntable values. So the render seems pretty good. I'm going to keep it all default. There's nothing that I want to tweak here. I'm going to now move over to movie menu. And over here, you're going to see a few different things. The only thing we want to be mindful of is turntable. So if I hit this button right now, it's going to record a turntable. But before I do so, I want to make sure that I adjust some of the settings here. So down here where you see dock, window, medium, large, small, all this stuff, we're going to switch this to document. We want it to record the document settings, which basically means, if I go to document menu again, it means this resolution, okay? So I'm going to go back over here to movie, we'll switch it to dock, and under this, let's make sure that the scale of the movie is set to large, so we get the full settings. And now let's dig through some of these menus here. I'm going to first go to modifier. Now modifiers, this is where we're going to basically set the frame range of our turntable. So let's say the spin of this is going to be 180 frames. That's, what is that? Something like 6 seconds, I think. 6 seconds, that's not too bad. Let's go ahead and keep it at that. We're going to go ahead and make sure it's 24 frames per second. That's fine. Frame size 1. Playback speed. I think this we probably want to set to 24 as well. And cursor size, let's leave that alone. We're spinning it on the y-axis, which basically means, you know, what you guys would want. So make sure that's set to y. Spin cycles only 1. Everything else seems pretty straightforward. Keep it all set the way it is, okay? So again, running from the top, frame size, just make sure that's all the way to 1. Recording frames per second, 24 is fine. You may want to set it to 30. It's totally dependent on you, but 24 is fine. Just make sure that the playback speed is identical to that, so we have a nice 1-to-1 sync. Snapshot time, I don't really know what that does. We want to skip menus. Anti-alias or capture, that's correct. On mouse, that's fine. Okay, that's all looking good. Now if I go down to title image right at the bottom, this basically does a fade in and out of the ZBrush logo. We don't want that. So we're going to turn this off by setting it both to 0. Overlay image, we don't want anything. Set the opacity of this to 0. And lastly, I think we're set. So at that point, that's usually all that I check for as I'm setting this up. Now, here's something very important. I'm going to go ahead and render this out so we see what we get. But the main thing to also make sure I mention here is that it's going to render whatever it sees here. So right now, if I'm to move this, and you see how now it's not rendered? Even if my render settings are set properly, if I go back to movie and hit turntable, it's going to render it like this. It's going to look like what you see here. So you want to make sure before you hit that turntable button, before you hit this button right here, turntable, make sure you go to render and hit BPR so that you get that image the way you want. You get that render to be realized. So here it's going to go through the paces. Renders doesn't take too bad. It's totally dependent on your model and the settings you have. So we'll do that. Okay. Now I'm going to go to movie and I'm going to hit turntable. And now when you hit that at the top, it's basically going to go and do its thing. So I have, what, 180 frames or so here that it needs to render. I'm going to let it do its thing. I'm going to stop the recording for right now. And once it's finished, I will turn this back on and we'll see what we have. Okay? All right, sit tight.